Welcome, everybody. Welcome to first community conversation. The community conversation today is with Tracy Myers and Paul Manley. I'd like to welcome everybody that's tuning in. Before we start, I'd like to make a territorial acknowledgement that we are on the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nations, and that the riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith the community conversation today is with the riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith also includes the traditional territories of the Snanawas, Stuminus, and Layaxan First Nations. A lot of disturbing things are happening in the world right now, especially in the US, but what we're seeing in the US is a result of structural racism, and it is important to note that we have the same issues going on in Canada in regards to people of color and Indigenous people. And we'll likely touch on that later in the discussion. I'm gonna give a slight overview of what's gonna happen this evening. Paul will introduce our guest Tracy after he gives a brief overview of his work lately. And then Tracy will give an overview of her background, and we will get into some of the thoughts that were shared in the thought exchange. And that will be interspersed by a discussion of some of the issues that Tracy has been seeing and is aware of her work and past background. So I'm just gonna, just one moment. There we go. And so before I pass it over to Paul, I'd like to say one word about people. I'll ask everybody to be friendly in the YouTube comments section. And people can also, if you want to drop questions or comments in the YouTube comments section, we'll try to get to them during the conversation. We did have a lot of thoughts in the thought exchange, and so there is a lot to cover, but we might be able to cover some things from the comment section as well. So I'd like to now pass it over to Paul.
All right, well, thank you, and good evening to everybody. Thanks for coming out to this Zoom meeting. This is how I spend my days, virtual parliament right here, and in lots of committee meetings. It's been a really interesting time doing this. I left Parliament on March 13th with a real heavy heart. We knew what was coming. We had seen it, coming. We had the warnings that we were hearing about in the media about other countries, and packed up the Parliament session and headed back home. And so this is where I do the business of the country, where I ask questions of the government, where I can make speeches, and where I'm involved in the committee process and answering emails from constituents and dealing with all of the different issues that people are facing during this COVID-19 crisis and the economic crisis that we're in as a result. So it's a difficult time. It's a difficult time to see a lot of people in my community going through a lot of pain and a lot of stress. And I didn't imagine that this is what I would be doing as a member of Parliament, but here I am, and these are the times that we're in, and we're working through this together. It's not an equal togetherness. We know that the people in lower income brackets are hit much harder by this. People that are frontline workers are hit much harder than by this. So I'm very well aware of that, and just, you know, working with my team, doing the best we can to help as many people in the community as we can. And the government is motivated to help people as well. And so thankfully, we're all working together as a team, Team Canada, to make sure that people are taken care of. I'm really happy to have Tracy Myers with us here this evening for this community conversation. I've known Tracy for a long time, I guess at least 15 years or more, and met her initially as a musician and spoken word artist, playing at CHLY outside in the courtyard there. And I've known Tracy for her work with Haven, because I've been to a number of Haven fundraising events, Walk a Mile in Her Shoes, and this other activist things that Tracy's been involved with in the community, speaking up on a whole range of issues, but on a lot of issues related to women and to domestic violence. And I know that Tracy's got a lot of experience as a counselor, and recently expanded your education to take on more knowledge about how to do that. And so it's great to have you here, Tracy. And I'll let you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be doing what you're doing now.
Thank you, Paul. It's a real honor to be here. I feel quite humbled and nervous. And I too want to honor that I live and work on Nanaimo territory and have been humbled and encouraged and inspired by my conversations and communications with many people in the Nanaimo community. Yeah, I could say more about my further background, but right now, yeah, I think that the part of my resume I feel most proud about, or I think that gives me in some sense the most cred, is that I've been working kind of in frontline work for nonprofits in anti-violence agencies for 20, maybe even 30 years. And owe a lot to the people that I've worked with and for, the children, the women, the men. You know, they, amongst others, have been teachers for me in this work. You mentioned that I recently went back to school, and I did. I sort of hit a point. I thought it would be really good to expand my knowledge. And, you know, frankly, in this system, sometimes without certain documents, it's difficult to move, you know, the way the world is, that sometimes lived experience or frontline experience, a lot of people don't maybe think that's enough. So I went back to school, and I was really enriched by that. I went to City University and had a lot of contact with a group of people that work at the response-based Center for Response-Based Practice. Kathy Richardson, Alan Wade, Linda Coates. There's some of the people that helped kind of frame what I do in a different way. And I also you know, I think I'm here because I worked with a whole bunch of really inspiring women at Haven Society, Karen Max and the whole women's counseling team, and the people that are on the peace team. You know, there's so many women that have inspired me and supported me. So right now I have, you know, what people call a private practice. I'm not at a nonprofit anymore right now. And I also do provincial training for peace program counselors. So I work for the British Columbia Society of Transition Houses and work to help train counselors who are working with children who experience domestic violence in their homes. And more recently, I've just been invited or included onto a national advisory committee to come up with some best practices and ways of working with young people who experience violence. So I'm honored to be on that sort of task force that will be advising the government. Yeah, I appreciate your introduction that these are difficult and possibly exciting and transformative times as well. But I think that, you know, we are seeing the unraveling of the structures that people have come to know as sort of our social structures. And I think laying bare of, under COVID-19 of what always has been here since colonization anyway, since the arrival of, people like my settlers. So as you mentioned, we're in it together, but we're not all in the same boat. And you made a speech in Parliament on the 20th that I was, I think it was the 20th of May. Happy to hear you acknowledge that, that this pandemic, while people can say, the virus doesn't discriminate, it is impacting our culture with huge gaps and huge inequities. So in that way, we're not in the same boat at this time. I maybe said more than my introduction, but we could get into it maybe.
Well, I just, noting that one of the things that hasn't been part of the information that we're given by government is where are the outbreaks in which parts of the community. And the one place that has happened is in Toronto.
Yeah.
And where they've seen large outbreaks in Toronto is in the projects, the social housing where a number of people are living in a place together, and they're in apartment towers where there's a lot of places like that. And those people are working in essential service jobs, whether that's in care homes or at the hospital as cleaners or
Sure.
In grocery stores, in all kinds of different jobs, people who are not normally seen and recognized by the society. And they're taking public transit. And so they're much more susceptible to picking up this virus in so many different ways. And that's what that information that was released in Toronto, was showing, that it's people in low income neighborhoods, people who are people of color, people who are marginalized in the workforce. And so it has not affected the society in an equal way at all.
No, and as well, I mean, one aspect is, who is most vulnerable maybe to come in contact with the virus, but as well, just who has a home, who has work, who has food on the table, there are many ways that staying at home, or as we probably will discuss today, who's safe at home, or what is the environment at home that people are in. And in looking at the thought exchange, it really, there are so many themes that people are speaking about in this community. I don't really know how that technology works. I think it's quite cool. And there's a lot of it, right? Like so much information is gathered that way. And I think here too, that many Indigenous communities have been bracing themselves, that so many families live intergenerationally, and the threat to many elders, like precious knowledge keepers in communities, and doing what they can to try and resist people coming in to protect themselves.
Yeah.
And of
Nanaimo has done that for sure. They've hired a private security team to make sure that people aren't coming into the community.
Yes.
And they're protecting their elders and their community. And on my bookshelf there is a book I was reading, that I started reading just after Christmas, called Clearing the Plains. And it is about all the different pandemics that First Nations have been through.
Right.
And,
yes.
in many cases deliberately spread.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the context that we're in, right? That we often, I mean, it's sort of like the quiet story behind the story. Like I was thinking today, I've been thinking a long time since we talked about this, about some things that I think are important to think about when we talk about wellness or mental wellness. Because, the history of, let's say, my profession comes from sort of Vienna, late 1800s, and a group of psychiatrists who, Freud being one of them, sort of developed the talking cure. And so the roots of my profession come from a very narrow group of people who got to decide what mental wellness meant. And to frame the world as if the world is a benevolent place, as it must have been for those men who had so much power in their society. The world is a safe and wonderful place. So when you have that frame of wellness, then how do you pathologize people who are experiencing structural and personal racism? Because that's, if the world is a benevolent place, then everyone who has what we're calling anxiety or depression is pathologized. And it's done, and I'll talk about how we frame this in COVID, but it's done with this book, right? This is the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual. This is sort of the Bible of mental health, as it's called. And so, this is contains a list of symptoms and then categorized under diagnoses. And while it can be really helpful for people to have a diagnosis, because it can also come with money and funding, the idea that anxiety is a pathology, or that, people under COVID being isolated and alone are experiencing anxiety as if that wouldn't be a predictable outcome.
Yeah.
Of being isolated.
Looking at that, at the thought exchange, there were lots of thoughts about increased anxiety and stress, either by people themselves or noticing it in others around them, like family members, on social media, at the store. And so there's a lot of uncertainty that triggers higher anxiety for many people.
Yeah.
And people concerned about other people feeling isolated and not sure how best to support them, while protecting their boundaries, their own boundaries and their own mental health. So it's hard to find a balance between supporting others and protecting your own emotional health when you're at at capacity for adjusting to your own stress. So how would you, what kind of thoughts come to your mind, like looking at those kind of comments?
Well, I guess that's maybe the line that part, I think, of what causes deep mental unwellness in many people is to feel outside the norm of the human experience. If in my life, when I have felt outside the norm of human experience, it's deeply isolating. We are animals that need to connect. We have survived through being connected to each other. And to normalize that being anxious is a predictable outcome of a pandemic, of an uncertain future, of being cut off from everything we know and love, that is actually a sign of mental wellness. To have those experiences, we have decided that anxiety is sort of outside the range. Like, we don't want anxiousness. We don't want to feel anxiousness, but when it is something that makes sense, it's not a pathological response. I think then we start feeling less alone. We don't have many opportunities like this for people to gather and read. Actually, people feel more settled when they know I'm not alone actually in this. There's a lot of people experiencing stress and anxiety right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if I can just, kind of bring an example to maybe highlight what I'm talking about.
Sure.
Am I making sense, Paul?
Yep.
Okay. Some while ago, I worked with a man who described that he was suffering from anxiety. This is, it's during COVID, although he didn't identify that COVID was the result. He said he'd actually had it for quite a long time in his life. When we spoke and I asked him about if he remembered you know, for how long had he been feeling this way? He had this sort of intense pressure in his chest and a feeling of anxiousness. He recalled an experience of intense violence as a boy being attacked by other boys. Now, he told me that he'd never had anyone respond the way that I did. The boys, it was an extremely violent attack, and he was a very large boy, and he became kind of his body became the site of aggression. No one had ever responded, I guess, in the way that I did, which was to really, like, he could have died, such a traumatic event to happen, that the violence that he was undergoing was completely, in a way, normalized in male culture. And he'd never kind of made the connection that his anxiety came from a body being the target of violence.
Mm-hmm.
He thought he had a problem. He thought he had kind of a pathological problem, that he suffered from anxiety. He'd been medicated. He was, you know, and so I guess what I'm talking about is that to understand that we are responding to abnormal and unnatural events in ways that make sense.
Yeah.
And there can actually be a reduction in anxiety for us when we know this is pretty normal.
Yeah. This is how you should be feeling.
This is kind of, and you know, and I don't mean, there's many ways to respond to this. There are some people that are noticing that obligations that they've had to do or have dropped away, and they actually feel more restful. So they were living a kind of life that was calling them to do all kinds of things, and now they have permission to stop. And that's so, you know, I guess there isn't like one normal, but many people are finding disconnection from touch extremely painful. Mm-hmm. You know, I have a good friend that really thrives off physical touch with people, giving a hug when she sees someone. And of course that will be painful for her right now. You know, I think we have to think about who we are centering in the conversation, like whose life is at the center of what we're thinking about when we talk about COVID.
All right, I'm gonna read a couple of other thoughts. We had a lot of people expressing how media and social media have added to their stress in the last few months. Here's a few thoughts. After the first week in March, I withdrew from reading or listening to the news, except to try to understand how to keep us safe. Watching some of the horrifying images from other countries was something I deliberately blocked. I meditated a bit, prayed a bit, journaled a lot. Another thought was, everyone is talking about using social media and virtual platforms to connect, but this isn't always a positive solution. Mm-hmm. So many virtual meetings already. The last thing I want to do in my free time is more virtual, and social media can be toxic and anxiety triggering. There's another related thought saying the polarization on social media seems to be getting worse every year. COVID-19 has added to the fire. It makes me sad. And one more, I have felt engulfed in bad news for the past 2 to 3 months. It has been wearing me down.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I learned a long time ago is not to watch the news. I listen to radio for the news, and I have trouble watching any kind of violence, and there's a lot of violence on television, you know, like real violence. And it's one thing when it's dramatized or whatever, but just the images that I find can have a real effect on me. And I didn't watch the George Floyd video. It took me about a week to do it. And then I did, and then I was really upset. But it's social media is another thing like that. It can be just a rabbit hole of darkness sometimes. It can be very light and fun sometimes, but it just depends on where things are going. Where, you know, you want, you know, all of these algorithms. You want more of this? I'll show you more of this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a few thoughts about that, about the, the people writing in. I mean, I think it's unprecedented that we are so completely physically isolated and yet so in touch with so many things happening on the globe. I don't know that processing that, it's kind of like, when has this been in human history that we, at the touch of a finger, I can find out all kinds of stories from around the world that wouldn't just be in my local community, and that I also, maybe I feel like I can have an impact in my local community. So the sort of disconnection and despair that can take place when we know of things that are happening, and yet we feel quite powerless, because, hope is an incredibly therapeutic and important feeling, and kind of the spirit of that to connect to for our wellness when we feel hopeless and despair about all these huge things. So I understand why people, and social media also has a way that, people can speak and communicate almost without consequence. So the ways that people interact are so different than they would if they were actually sitting in a room together. It almost, like, people can put something out and walk away, and there it is out in the universe for other people to receive, and it can be full of a lot of vitriol and hate, and well, there it is. So I know a lot of people are kind of numbing out on on Netflix, we can only take in so much. I also recognize that I am, by virtue of the fact that I can turn off violence, is a statement of how much privilege I have.
Yeah.
That I can kind of step away from it and choose to look at it or not, does kind of lay bare my location on the planet. It's not an option for so many people, right? It's not sort of like, and I don't mean to say that means I'm a bad person. It's nothing about guilt, but where I stand and who I am and the different privileges I have, I think that's something, right now, definitely people with white skin privilege, we're really noticing white supremacy as being a part of the culture we live in. And I was speaking with someone today who, shared many experiences of intense racism here in Canada that her community and herself have experienced. And, that there's righteous anger about that. So in terms of COVID and people writing in and saying, social media or the media has made it in some ways more difficult, I agree. I think some people have been enjoying stepping outside in their communities and making noise at 7:00, or, making music across the street from each other, or actually more embodied ways of safely being together at this time than maybe tuning in to something like this. Go out and sing across the street. You shouldn't be listening. Yeah, I'm connecting with my family on Zoom while I'm seeing people in my business on Zoom, and I'm connecting with my friends on Zoom, and getting my body out and away from the screen to take a walk somewhere is the most therapeutic part of my day.
Yeah. I know I had one week that was just super intense, and on the Friday afternoon, I realized that I hadn't left the house in a week, and I hadn't had a walk in a week.
Yeah.
It's been like, the lockdown for me has been to this seat right here.
I bet.
And, sometimes it's virtual committees and virtual parliament for 6-8 hours, and meetings on top of that, drag it out into a much longer day. But you're so right about this privilege that we have to not be dealing with violence, in all of its different forms. and in so many places in the world, that is just not an option for people. So, yeah.
I've been thinking about you because I saw you had a video where you were playing the drums, right? Inviting me. I think you invited me, and I was kind of I didn't even answer you. I'm sorry. I didn't even answer you to come out and bang a drum at 7 o'clock. But yeah, I do think about movement and green and the forest and nature and how much of the culture we live in doesn't often acknowledge that as a source of healing and wellness. And when I say the culture we live in, I kind of mean the dominant sort of Eurocentric culture. You have to take sort of a specialty in outdoor therapy. It's not included in regular counseling that being in nature is healing. And so many peoples have known this throughout time. Yeah. And yet, the idea to walk and be surrounded and have green, fill our eyes. And in Nanaimo, there are, within this territory, I mean, in that way, we're also privileged in that there's incredible green spaces accessible in almost every part of this community, whether it's the dam downtown or the waterfront or Westwood, everywhere, Bowen Park. I have a friend who has told me that she often has a really anxious feeling inside, and it's not there when she's in nature, that is soothed, so it's an odd thing that many of us might forget that or not access it.
Yeah. No, it's a privilege to have a garden in the backyard and have a little bit of space in the house, because a lot of people don't have that option, and people are in close quarters, and that leads to all kinds of other issues, whether it's just people trying to work together with kids at home or what other stresses. So Alan, you were gonna.
Yeah, we have we've had some thoughts about people feeling the weight of responsibility and stress of dealing with families with health issues. We've also had somebody make a comment about working with clients, and sometimes the clients wake her up in the middle of the night, and the stress that causes, and how to deal with that. I guess the stress of the clients and the stress of the person dealing with the clients. A couple of thoughts that came up in the thought exchange was in social distancing isolation with a spouse with multiple health issues, I have felt anxious and also aware of a huge responsibility for him. It has forced me to endeavor to spend my time being positive and creative. Life is precious. And as well, another thought was my husband is profoundly deaf and has been suffering from depression. He is at risk with his health issues. I have felt isolated and at times overwhelmed and burdened by responsibility.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, you can hear that in the writing of all that woman is holding, and it's like too much to hold alone, right? Like without community, without support, I have a few thoughts. Paul, did you want to jump in before I say something, or?
No, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, I think I thought of the person that's awake. It really, whether it's a client or a family member, I suppose, the idea that we're kind of these isolated units is really problematic. We die in isolation, we die without touch. We are in so much need of connection with each other. And I think that something like this pandemic highlights how our structures have been actually built to isolate us. It actually has been set up in a way that connection is so difficult. And of course, COVID has special circumstances around it, but I don't know about you, Paul or Elan, but where I live, we don't have any like community sort of gathering place here. This place has not been designed that all of us have a kind of place to come together. Now, some people might have a local pub or a coffee shop, but sort of a hall, or what small communities often have. And so we're in these isolated houses or isolated apartments without even the structures to easily connect. So a woman who is at home with her husband who's deaf, feeling the weight of his health and his care, there's no sort of easy thing that she can, COVID is heightening how there isn't any easy access for her to find community and support and connection. If we were organized in a different way, if we thought about how could we be organized so that, you know, our homes and our communities are set up to increase connection, that's what we need, I think we would all be doing quite a bit better right now. Instead of social media, live ways to connect, live, easy ways for us to see each other, even if we're social distancing, right? So I guess that's what I meant too about how this pandemic is really illuminating so many gaps and holes, not just poverty, and I don't mean just, but not only poverty and racism inequities, but that we've actually built a culture to support isolation and loneliness.
Yeah, just I mean, look at the suburbs. Look at the way the suburbs are designed. Or my apartment building in Ottawa, you know, I've got all these people around me, but there's no connection, and you don't bump into people in the hallways, or you know, right. and during the pandemic anyway, you're not supposed to have more than one person in the elevator, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
One of the things about going out and banging pots and pans that I really enjoyed is that I could hear my neighbors next door doing it and getting in on it. Like the first time I did it with the drum set, they weren't sure what I was up to, and then I let them know. And then my neighbors down the way could see me, and they would come out on their balconies, and you know, we're quite a distance apart, but we would bang pots and pans together, and I could start to hear everybody else in the neighborhood doing it too. So I was just imagining all the kids down the street, you know, just out doing the same thing. So
yeah,
those kind of things, like seeing people getting out on their balconies and singing in Italy, and you know, that didn't carry on the whole time, because I think people became worn down in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
You know, we have so much resilience, and then one of the comments I saw on here was, you know, somebody saying that they feel more tired than normal, and I think that's interesting, because you can, if you have a lot of time on your hands and you're maybe not out doing the things that you normally do, you're not expending that energy, you're not picking up energy from other people the way that you normally do. Like it's a very different experience here speaking to my computer in a virtual parliament than it is with 338 other MPs in question period. It's a completely different experience.
Absolutely.
And so you don't have that energy to feed off, and it doesn't lift you the same way, right?
Yeah. And likewise, some people are describing to me that what they're actually doing is experiencing the exhaustion that they've probably been carrying for a long time, that we live in a culture of sort of like
fast pace,
multitasking and keep going. And, you know, I don't know if you've had that experience, but you know, you'll go, a project will end and you may suddenly get sick, because it's sort of like your body says, okay, now it's time. So, you know, I'm not surprised. People could be tired for many reasons. They could be actually letting themselves feel a deep fatigue that is there, because we are aware of what's happening on the planet, all of us, you know, and it's exhausting to know about that.
Yeah,
and it could be that, yes, we do gain, some of us, and I know there's extroversion and introversion, but many of us do gain support and energy and connection from being embodied with each other, and people could be missing that and feeling that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So some of the things that have come up is people talking about the community, and worrying about people who are lacking the community resources that they're used to relying on.
Yeah.
And people who are worrying about people in their community who have lost their livelihoods or businesses. and people concerned about community resilience going forward. And there were several thoughts about that. I'll just read a couple. I've witnessed the mental wellness of my family decline as interactions with family and friends outside our home is reduced.
Right.
I've witnessed the mental wellness of parents of young children decline as the community resources, supports, and structures are closed. I've
Right.
witnessed community members lose their businesses and livelihoods, causing deep depression and fear. As we brace for an era of pandemics, mental health will be a major factor in resilient families and communities.
Right.
We as a species have to adjust quickly to the new normal, and we require mental flexibility to continue adjusting. And I worry for the increased vulnerability of more people without access to normal community supports due to the public health safety restrictions.
Can you read that last one again, Ilan, that very last one?
Worry for the increased vulnerability of people who don't have access to the normal community supports because of the public health safety restrictions. So community supports that are gone because of the social distancing.
Yes, right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, I mean, one thing we talked about before we did this, and I'm just maybe wanting to address if there's anyone out there watching this, they may have thought that this would be sort of some tips on, you know, on how to feel better during this pandemic. And I'm not sure that that will be what everyone comes away with from this, you know. I'm just recognizing, you know, we're kind of listing a whole bunch of difficult things, and this isn't theoretical or academic. I'm impacted even hearing these things about people, as probably everyone is, right? This is the kind of mess we're in right now. And I think, you know, talking about really worried about people at home with kids, it's because it's not actually a sustainable way. We're structured in these nuclear families, which is so unsustainable. Or single parent families. As a human species, the idea of one parent or two parents even raising children, like everything that Ilan you're reading is like, we need each other. We need each other. We need support. We need connection. We are, you know, struggling without it. It's like so clear how much we are interdependent on one another in a culture that values independence. Right? Everything in our culture says he did it himself. He's a self-made man, you know, like a super mom who does everything and looks good cooking the thing and does it, like this idea that we're these
competitive beings competing with each other
and
for dominance. And actually when we are by our nature communitarian people, we've grown up, we've evolved as people who work together in community. And, you know, it takes a community to raise a child. That's not something that somebody just thought up. That is the way it happened.
Yeah.
And that is the way it needs to happen. And so all of those things, those structures and those things that we've relied on and taken for granted in some cases, we're realizing that that's what we really need. And I've seen comments in here about, you know, somebody missing the blues jam every Sunday because that's where they get out and they socialize, and it's something they look forward to every week, and it's an outlet, right?
Yes.
And those, you know, those kind of things we're realizing how important they are, and we're going to be coming back to them, and we're going to build on you know, from what we've learned and what we're going through psychologically here. I think it will help us build resilience. But it's also, you know, it's a very difficult time for people, and there is this wave of mental health that's happening. That's part of the COVID you know, pandemic. We're having an epidemic of mental health problems too, and so we need to be very aware of that and how we work through and come through this together and try to build the kind of society that we want. We think about, like, people thinking about their local businesses and the stress that that local businesses are going through.
Yes.
You know, Amazon is thriving during this.
Yeah.
And Jeff Bezos is going to be the first trillionaire on the planet
Yeah. Right.
because there's a pandemic.
Yeah.
And so we need to think about those things in terms of the health of our community and the health of those around us. Like, who is important to our community? It's, you know, the people in our community, the small businesses that hire the other people in our community. They are they are our community.
Yes.
And when you're talking about like your neighborhood and not having kind of that center, there's a little park in my neighborhood that we've had gatherings
Yeah.
in past years, and it's something you think, you know, that's more of what we really need to do. In my old house, we had alleyway parties where all the neighbors on the alley got together. It was kind of like a street party. And I think, you know, what, as we get into the warmer weather, those are things we should work on doing and keeping our social distance, for our physical distance, but not our social distance.
Yes.
Right? I think the whole idea, you know, naming it social distancing was kind of a problem too, because
Yeah.
it's physical distance that we need. And I
Yeah.
think that in some ways, you know, I pointed out the example of Taiwan many, many times, that they had simple solutions to keeping their economy up and running. And that was wearing masks and using hand sanitizer and having hand sanitizer in front of every building as a dispenser, and people wearing masks when they're in closed confined spaces, inside public spaces, and able to keep on going like that. They still have the physical distancing rules, but they're more connected than we have been by locking ourselves in our homes. And
Yeah.
I think that as we come through, we may be dealing with they say we may be dealing with another wave of this in the fall or in the winter time, but we have to be more prepared for how we work through that.
Yeah, I think you mentioning language and what we call things and making that distinction. I think I use the term social distancing because I think I wasn't really paying attention, but you're right. It's physical distancing is a different thing, isn't it? And the name we give to things is pretty important, like how we talk about what's happening and the language that we use. And you just used the phrase being locked in our house. And it, again, if we think about how this pandemic has impacted people differently, for sure, if you have, and I think in an earlier conversation with you, Paul, or maybe it was Elan, you talked about the privilege of safety, you know, at home, it being actually a privilege to be safe at home. And, you know, if, again, when I talk about that sort of mental health being framed and who we were basing our mental health on was really some white men in Vienna who came up with the idea of wellness and the talking cure. The same as who's deciding that it's safe at home. And if the voices of women, and in particular Indigenous women in this country, were at the center of what people were saying sometimes, let's say around safety, we may have recognized earlier than people are maybe just starting to talk about now, that a whole bunch of people aren't safe at home. That home is a site of terror, actually, for many people and for many women. And I know, and children. And so, and I often frame, you know, we talk about domestic violence, and that's a terrible term because it doesn't say anything. And, you know, of course, anyone can use violence. Women can use violence, men can use violence, people can use violence in heterosexual or same-sex relationships. There isn't any, but I do frame it as male violence against women because, as you know, and Elan, as you know too, and probably everyone who's listening, it's the documentation and the studies are there to show that we do have a problem, a gendered problem with violence. Trans people are at huge risk of violence. You know, that's where that word intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw, and anyone, when I first heard that word, it just sounded so academic and yucky and I hated it. But if you watch Kimberly Crenshaw on YouTube, who's a professor and an author and a theorist, talk about intersectionality, it just means like an intersection, a place where things meet. So not all women are the same, and I have many privileges over many other women. But generally on the planet, we are kind of looking at a real issue of male violence in all many manifestations. And in this community, I know, because I've worked with people, but I know everyone that is listening or tuning in knows someone, if not themselves, that has experienced that kind of terror at home. So a pandemic like this, for someone who home is a place that they're only safe when they leave, the impacts on that are very difficult to imagine and measure. Some countries in the world have experienced huge spikes in calls, whereas locally it's actually gone a little bit quiet, which is even more eerie. You know, it actually means people can't even phone or text. The surveillance is so intense. And I think of the children that live in those environments of stress. Whatever happens to a parent happens to a child. We used to think that if the violence didn't come directly to a young person, that they weren't impacted, and that doesn't make any sense anymore. They're dependent on their caregivers. If their mother is experiencing violence, it's happening to them. And there's a program in this community called Men Choose Respect. Teresa Gerritsen has been one of my brilliant mentors. I work in that program, and it was actually working in that program was the first time I felt like I was working to end violence against women, because I was actually working with the men who wanted to make a change in their behavior. As long as, you know, it's absolutely vital that we support the women and the children that are being victimized by this behavior. It's not about taking money from there and giving it to the men who are perpetrating it, but we need resources for this as well. Men who want to make a change in how they're behaving need to know where to go and what to do. And that's been, I think, some of my most powerful work is with, and many of the fathers, talking to them about their children. So in terms of COVID, you know, I know that the government has given some money, and we'll see what that translates to. But I think for a lot of people, that might be people who do have the privilege of being safe at home. This may be the first time they're really thinking about that. What is that like for someone who can't leave, who can't, you know, going to the grocery store? Something could be a huge relief for someone living under violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just, you know, people, I've heard from couples who work together, have a 1-bedroom apartment, and they're doing Zoom meetings all day, or they're, you know, multi-bed apartment with kids and doing Zoom meetings all day, and having to balance and juggle and just work with people in that confined space. And then if you're in a situation like that, where there's a lot of alcohol abuse, or where there's already abuse happening, and then a lot of alcohol that's being consumed, and things can just exacerbate. And then, you know, one of the things I'm sure you know about is that toolkit, right? Because I've been involved in that kind of peer-to-peer groups with men, where you're talking about accountability, and you talk about the tools. And one of those tools is to go and get yourself some space, and let yourself, you know, if you have anger issues, go find yourself a quiet space to calm down and think through what's going on in your head. And there's just no place to do that in some of these situations now, right? So those tools that counselors talk about are some of them just aren't available in these situations, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think we can could talk about, you know, violence and the choices people make to be violent. And I would never say that things don't exacerbate, but they certainly don't, and not that you said that, they certainly don't cause, you know, violence, that someone making a choice. So I would agree that a circumstance now, I would argue that, you know, we have Bonnie Henry or whoever has been advising us has never really said, don't leave at all your home, right? Like taking a walk around the block. There's always been a choice to do something actually to remove yourself from a situation. So I think it's actually more that the opportunity to escape has been removed. I think people always have opportunities to decide, you know, for example, if I become violent when I drink, then my decision to drink means I'm making a decision to possibly be violent, you know,
violent. Yeah,
if that happens, you know. So
yeah.
I think the way that we have kind of framed violence as this explosive thing that happens out of nowhere, you know, people, oh, we have so many ways to describe it, you know, their buttons get pushed. She pushed my buttons, right? As if the person is causing the violence themselves somehow, causing, you know, the sort of blaming the person who, you know, or we have a way to describe the system like in you know, what's happened in the States, let's say the most recent, you said you couldn't watch the video, that somehow it was about a bad apple, that it, you know, a certain police officer, and then there seems to be quite a few police officers kind of made a bad choice, you know, rather than seeing it more as structural and systemic.
And cultural.
Yeah, and that, you know, male violence against women is something that we have just become kind of used to. We've just actually become kind of used to that we live in a culture that perpetuates that way of treating women and excusing and somehow hiding who's really responsible for it, you know?
Yeah.
And of course, of course, this isn't about all men or all women or all anything, but it's just structural, and it's in the way that we speak about it and think about it. You know, in our earlier conversation, we will say violence against women.
Yeah.
But that doesn't say anything about who's doing the violence. It's like we've erased the perpetrator, you know? You've probably heard of that sort of grammatical, tell me, there's a Jackson Katz is an educator, sort of male.
Yeah, I've been to his workshops.
Yeah. So he does that thing with language, you know, where we'll say, Jack hit Mary, and Jack's the subject and Mary is the object. And, you know, Jack's pretty important in that sentence, Jack hit Mary. But we changed that to then Mary was hit by Jack. So now Jack is kind of at the end of the sentence. We're kind of really more looking at Mary. Mary was hit by Jack. The next sentence, Jack's not even there. Mary was hit. And then Mary becomes an abused woman finally. And so now we've got, what is wrong with Mary? Mary's an abused woman. And we're not even talking about the person who made the choice to be violent. So I think in this pandemic, when we're talking about that, I think rather than thinking about what are the pressures on the people that are being violent, because that's always a choice. And all of us can make a choice to do something different. I think it's important to think about the people who are trapped and how are we structured that we don't have ways, better ways to think about that, to think about, because people live in neighborhoods, there'll be people around this family.
Yeah.
So
well, that's, yeah,
sorry,
that's,
I'm getting kind of excited.
That whole situation in Nova Scotia was the people around that neighborhood all knew.
And told the cops.
What's that?
Told the cops.
Yeah, and told the cops.
And told the cops that he had rifles and he had a bevy and they were afraid.
And he was an abuser.
I mean, this is a story how many times, I think that's when we look at the States and the powder keg, people, I think African-American people have been patient beyond belief with what's going, like, not even, it's not patience, but they have been restrained, you know, and I think that, I think I'm getting excited.
Yeah. one of the things that, this hand signal, right? To show that hand signal for people who need help, and just to give that, you know, in a casual conversation, to be able to show that on a phone or for people to know that they need help in a situation.
Yeah. Yes, Ilan.
So we're coming to the end here, but there's a few things that I wanted to say. I'm going to read a few. There were a few notes of people who expressed actually gratitude for what they're experiencing, and I do think, and there are people who are experiencing, as you said, Tracy. Some people are realizing how much stress they were carrying, and now suddenly they're in a situation with less stress. So I do want to read a few of those because those comments were liked and starred well by some other people, and they're legitimate and real experiences. And also I wanted to tell people that there's a bunch of resources that that Tracy's put together that we are going to have in the on Paul's website, along with the link to people to watch this later, so people can check out those resources, community resources, some counselors, other thinkers, some of the names that Tracy's mentioned during this talk. So I'm just going to read a few more thoughts. So some people realize that they actually have good mental health resources in themselves throughout this experience. So somebody wrote that having pre-existing mental health conditions seems to have strengthened my defenses in some ways to observing so much stress in everyone else. Seeing everyone stress out makes me monitor my inner reactions differently, and I seem to be able to de-stress and calm myself effectively. Right. It's made, another person wrote, it's made me a bit more aware. Though I have coped with bouts of depression most of my life, coping mechanisms are now in place and have helped. I am fortunate in this rather bizarre backhanded way. Close friends and family are at reach through FaceTime, social media, and that is good enough for now. And then other people wrote about feeling a deeper appreciation for what they have during these past few months. Thankful for the love and companionship of their dog. And some person joined several COVID-19 Facebook groups and is thoroughly enjoying all their new connections. Some person discovered grocery deliveries for the first time and find that that's fantastic. And they've experimented with lots of new and fun foods and cooking. Love having the extra time to connect with family and friends and help others through this difficult time. My relationship with my depressed sister greatly improved as I have had a lot more time for her whenever she calls. And there's a few more others that that sort of express positive sort of things. And that also, I think that also relates to sort of how we lived our life before. And the fact that just like we finally have a moment where we have permission and in fact are being mandated to slow down and to stop running. And suddenly we become aware of things that we weren't aware of before. And, you know, time for family, more time for depressed sister, or time for connecting with people and for cooking and stuff like that. So it's not all horrible, and I think it's good to acknowledge that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for reading all those.
Yes, people who are able to make something out of the situation.
So I really want to thank Tracy and Paul and everybody else that joined us, and the people who made comments on the YouTube. This is very informative. I know that it made me think a lot. Just reading the thoughts on the Thought Exchange made me think a lot about my own experience and how I've dealt with the last 3 months. And it's been hard at times for me too. And very hard. In fact, last week I was pretty down. This week I feel a lot better. So, and I'm definitely aware of so much privilege and just blind luck that I've had in being born to who I was born, and everything that's happened to me in my life. And aware that, you know, I sometimes don't want to watch the news, and there's people who are living that news. So they don't have a choice about watching it or not, as you guys talked about.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll give you guys last words to Tracy and Paul, and I'm going to sign out after that.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Tracy, for joining us for this community conversation. And it's been interesting. I love this thought exchange program where people can just share things and
Yeah.
push
I-
those ideas up that they like. And yeah.
I really, I think I've just started to breathe now, so I really appreciate the opportunity to come here. I appreciate what you're doing in Parliament, and thank you, Elan. Thank you for the invite. Yeah, I've appreciated to think about it, and especially to hear from people, you know, how people are doing on across the spectrum, you know. So I know you have another one coming. I think it's a great thing, this thought exchange and these community conversations. So
Yeah,
thank you so
we'll be
much.
doing a few more of them over the
Yeah,
coming week.
thanks for mentioning that. Actually, this is a good
Yeah.
moment to plug. Next week's community conversation is going to be with agriculturalist Farmer Brown, Chris Brown, and that's going to be same day, same time, Wednesday at 7 p.m. And we'll probably have a thought exchange leading to that as well. And then the week after that, we're going to have Chris Beaton of the Nanaimo Aboriginal Center is going to join as well. That's in 2 Wednesdays at 7 p.m. So please join us for community conversations coming up. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks for
Thank
tuning
you.
in.
Yeah.
All right, take care, stay safe, and stay healthy.
Yeah, have a
Bye.
great night.
Yeah. Bye-bye.